When God of War released in 2018, it received mammoth prestige from nearly all major outlets, despite going into a direction that was very far away from its roots. With intense combat, a story fulfilling, a bold and striking hero, beauty abound to its world, certainly is one of the best games of the year by far. Almost 3 years later, I decided to go back and play the entire game again, looking to see how it holds up today. And for the most part, those accolades still hold true. However, it's clear that some of its flaws perhaps were overlooked. This does happen quite a bit in our industry when star titles come out, as the hype train goes choo-choo. In this video, I hope to highlight the good and bad of God of War with a fairly intimate look at its combat system, world, pacing, camera, story, and more. Not with the intention of tearing down the greatness of the game or being nitpicky for the sake of it, but rather just the thoughts of a longtime God of War fan who now sees the game just a little bit more clearly. There will be some spoilers near the end of the video, but I'll make sure to announce them appropriately. Please enjoy.
It's the World Serpent!
The first thing I'll be discussing is how God of War's camera and gameplay system deal with trade-offs. Trade-offs are defined as taking this instead of that, feature A over feature B, and they're found in every single game. Sometimes because you don't have the capacity to include both, and sometimes because adding in one literally restricts you from doing the other. In God's case, the biggest trade-off manifests itself with a unique camera system. God of War chooses a single frame, close camera instead of a traditional pulled back camera which defined its prior games, and this comes with a big trade-off. The choice to bring the point of view right behind Kratos' right shoulder makes God of War feel extremely intimate. You can tell this was a priority from the very first scene, where Kratos cuts down a tree and slowly carries it back to his home. This is followed up with some extremely close shots of Atreus lighting candles for his dead mother. Cutscenes are almost this invasively close, with characters taking up half or sometimes most of the screen just with their models alone. This is a lot different than watching a cutscene where most of the detail gets obscured by a bird's eye view. Or playing this God of War game. There's no science behind it, it just feels completely different, all due to this one fundamental thing, camera placement. This is very intentional game design. The game garners plenty of benefits from this, such as detail and communicating information to players, which is a good thing. Up close, you can pick up on a grimace or a frown to indicate disapproval, which would have required actual dialogue from afar to convey the same message. A wondering gaze hinting at uncertainty. Is it possible to surmise what her facial expression hints at? Well, yes, only with a camera this close. Subtle movement to approximate state of mind, such as Atreus bouncing in place to show that he's getting impatient or bored, or walking the camera right between the two as they speak in whispers. We may know now that no one should be able to hear them. We can deduce this just because of the camera placement alone. It allows players to infer the state of mind or the moods of these characters by simply paying attention to not just what the game explicitly tells them, but what they can gather from what the game is showing them. Ever heard of the expression show, don't tell? God of War is damn effective at it. It almost makes you feel like you're sort of there, even though you're not, because you're not relying on the game to point out all of its intricacies to you. This is especially important in this God of War game because so much of the story is driven through character interactions, in which the words spoken can often mean something much different than how the character truly feels. Kratos by himself is extremely terse, which amplifies the need to switch on more senses than reading his subtitles, because that alone won't get you very far. Often, what he doesn't say means just as much as what he does say, or the way he reacts, such as when Baldur punches him in the face during the game's introduction. This look right here says everything a line of dialogue could say times 1,000. Why is this? Well, we could say that the amazing motion cap brought this moment to life, but that doesn't explain how that moment gets translated to the player, because those are two different things. And the answer to that is the camera placement. When the camera is this close, we can see the anger and the dismay captured by Christopher Judge's amazing performance. You could spend as much money as you want creating this moment, but it all comes down to framing it in a way that creates the most impact for what you want to get out of it. And in this case, we want players to pick up on the way Kratos feels without telling us how he feels, because that would cheapen the moment. This is why the entire movie industry is built upon the backdrop of cinematography. It's incredibly difficult to pull this off because the extreme camera requires convincing execution for it to be believable. And by God, it is so convincing in this title. The voice work and subtle detail create lifelike interactions that you can infer from, and it's only one moment of many in God of War. Somehow, psychologically, the coddling framing just draws you in. The entire game is one long marathon of intimacy. Not only does it make God feel as intense as an actual movie, but it also plays on the central theme of the game, to which I'll explain later. However, like all things, there is a trade-off. God's camera creates problems in the gameplay departments because it's always tucked in this close. First of all, the camera creates a very restrictive point of view that can be both detrimental for player visual aid and just difficult to manipulate. On one hand, having Kratos so large on the screen means that players get to see all of the dazzling special effects and subtle sleight-of-hand animations that you could tell took a lot of work to get looking right. One such detail I loved was when Kratos reaches for his axe while unarmed. The axe seems to come to life, snapping into his fist with a faint vorpal effect as it displaces the space around his back. The screen then shakes as a bassy thud echoes. This awesome effect would have been more difficult to pick up on and lost a lot of punch with Kratos pushed forward into the frame more. And there are tons of these tiny details everywhere to be found that benefit from the FOV. Graphical effects, enemy movement patterns, the way dashing and rolling affect how Kratos' clothes move in the game space, the heavy feedback from smashing an enemy and watching him reel back in agony. Good God, does it look, feel, and sound awesome, all because they simply plucked the camera from the peanut gallery and moved it here. However, navigating the battlefield becomes more difficult since you simply can't see as much, and that's very important in an action game. For the most part, it's hard to keep your eye out on the left or the right of Kratos. It's also pretty damn impossible to see anything behind him, which sounds snobbish to point out. Of course you can't. That is until you play other third-person action games where the camera is pulled back just a little bit more, wherein you can actually see enemies in the rear a little bit. Here, no matter how good your peripheral vision is, you simply can't see beyond the screen borders, and there's no option to change the camera viewpoint. This is God of War's trade-off for having its close camera angle. God knows this because it tries to circumvent the frustration by relaying information off-screen for players since they have that limited vision. For the most part, that means displaying on-screen indicators and the occasional warning shot from Atreus, which is fine in theory, however, it's hardly the most optimal mechanic due to its unreliability. That's because if you're playing a game where you can see the threat coming in advance, you'll have more time to plan your next move. It's much easier in a game like Bloodborne to make smart choices during combat because you can see threats coming before the indicator would signal in a game like God of War. If you see the enemy's hand start to glow, you know he's about to throw a fireball. If you see an enemy start to reload a crossbow, you know about how much time before he's about to draw on fire. Ghost of Tsushima makes great use of spatial awareness, providing not just visual and audio cues in the same vein as God of War, but a wide angle of view which helps eliminate unknowns. This gives player far more information to which they can make calculated decisions. Of course, this means the two games feel extremely different, which is the point. Trade-offs both give and take away. More tools allow players to play confidently, to make decisions on what to do next instead of reacting after it's already too late. A lot of the time that's built into what are called tells, small patterns of behavior or movements that happen just before actions. If you see one, you know what's coming and can punish the enemy for it. The same goes for any reference point or animation you notice. If you spot it early, you have the chance to react to it. And that is satisfying stuff because you yourself identified it. It's also important to understand that a flashing indicator doesn't tell you how far away the enemy is who's attacking you, nor does it tell you what enemy is attacking you, information that you would have been able to deduce if you could actually see it coming, obviously. If you don't know the enemy type or distance, you then can't anticipate when the attack will hit or account for travel time for projectiles. Windups or safe frames to which you can counter, dodge, roll, spin around to meet, or parry. All of these are fundamental mechanics used in God's combat. In the case of God of War, the system tends to be overly sensitive to everything such that the indicators become hardly reliable for timing off-screen enemy attacks. Enemy attacks often don't sync up with what angle is being shown, and those strikes can also go through the hitboxes of other enemies when they're bunched up, which leads to more guessing games. It's also important to note that this is not a hit scan game, as projectiles do not lock on to Kratos, so it's possible to dodge every single one in this game. This makes it important to be able to analyze the battlefield preemptively because you can move out of the way. So typically the best option when you see an indicator pop up is to dodge and hope for the best, which if you guess wrong, you're typically punished immediately. If you guessed correctly, you'll be safe. However, Kratos is still at the mercy of the lock-on, which can be random enough that there's no telling where you'll end up facing or at what angle. In a game that features sudden, unblockable moves that can nearly one-shot you, the narrow camera and view of Kratos can sometimes feel like a burden. Makes for a great cinematic, gritty experience, but not the most precise combat system, as it can test your patience rather than testing your abilities as a player. Not to mention be absolutely brutal for enemies that have hard-hitting, lunging attacks that are very sudden. During boss fights, you'd think its perspective would subvert these issues since you don't have to worry about what's behind you mostly, but the giant scale of some of these monsters requires the camera to be pointed upwards to fit it on the screen, which reduces your surrounding vision even more. Even bosses relatively the same size as Kratos have this issue going on when airborne or spinning around Kratos with combos. It's just hard to keep a central viewpoint of what's going on in this game because you simply can't see that much. And for those playing on Give Me God of War difficulty, that's really important. Kratos can cancel some attacks in order to help him react in combat, and the game does have invincibility frames for certain runic attacks or windups, but those times don't seem to be universal or consistent across different attack types. It's also a nice feature to have an instant camera flip button on the D-pad, but using it is not practical or comfortable at all, considering you have to give up your right hand to reach it, which might lead to, at worst, death. Factor in the often extremely late unblockable indicators on some enemies, which can be devastating, and it can be an extremely punishing system to interact with, while not being as flexible or informative as it should be. This is why the game gives the player two forms of the traditional dodge, rolling and sidestepping, or back dodging. Rolling is more work to pull off, but effective for spacing as it creates more distance and generates the player more invincibility frames. On the other hand, sidestepping is easier to input and faster, but gives you less safety and doesn't prevent splash damage. It does, however, give you enough time to complete the last hit of a combo after executing a sidestep, which is very important as those are the most damaging. Either way, giving players access to more than one dodge tool was a really good choice, as it's more difficult to see and react to threats off-screen in this game than most other similar titles. God's combat is also very lenient on spacing, which adds to uncertainty. Spacing just refers to how well the player is able to judge when their attacks will land on enemies and when attacks will land on them. It's hard to predict this because enemies will often advance through the game space very unnaturally when they execute attacks, which makes it a guessing game where they're going to land. This is exacerbated when finishing a combo where the final attack suddenly jolts them forward. There's a lot of this free forward momentum in this game. This goes for Kratos as well, giving him additional range on his charge-up attacks so they connect, teleporting him to his target. It looks odd, as the game has to connect two different targets that shouldn't be in range by squishing the space in between. It's natural for a game to want to make sure players stay in range of their attacks so they don't constantly whiff every attack, because that might discourage developers from designing enemies with complex move mechanics. After all, if you can't hit something because it's just out of reach all the time, it wouldn't be very fun for the player. This is exactly why Revenants and Dark Elves are the most infuriating enemies in this game. I don't like the idea of tracking, which is common in third-person combat systems, and especially the idea of invisible gap closing, which is the equivalent of giving Kratos a booster seat at the dinner table. It's a little weird to see him slide towards enemies like he has rollerblades on, and seems intentionally put in this game as a concession for its extremely narrow FOV. I imagine the way health pickups were designed had some consideration for the camera system too. Enemies will sometimes drop health potions for Kratos to pick up, instead of relying on a regenerative health system. I assume they chose this for the sole reason that it gives players more of a reason to keep an eye out on their environment. Obviously, it's important to know where to retreat to pick up a potion, but really what the game is doing is promoting the idea that players learn spatial awareness, as running around the gameplay arena will give them that information that the camera does not. This makes sense for a game that has limited FOV, off-screen threats that can't be seen, enemies that zip around constantly, and a very annoying fog effect during multiple encounters that takes away all of your vision. So even though the camera creates these hassles, God of War is still a rather good hack and slasher when you break it down to its fundamentals. It's heavy, it's brutal, it's beautiful, it's flashy, and the various tools Kratos can use make it tactical and downright satisfying. The introduction of the Leviathan Axe is a welcome piece of equipment that is not only one of the best the series has seen, but it helps make God of War feel different enough from those other games. Not only is it a vicious melee weapon, but a projectile at the same time, allowing Kratos to fill multiple roles in combat with a single weapon. Its design is actually ingenious, as it can be thrown freely with one button and called back with another. Given the right angle, it can rip through multiple enemies during the recall. Once Kratos gets the ability to quick throw, which can be used during lock-on, even more options open up. Naturally, the axe can be seen as somewhat of a handicap for players who want to turtle up and play safely from a distance. It's true, this approach is more or less effective at all stages of the game, but it's far from optimal. Environmental awareness, as previously mentioned, is difficult already, and spending so much time aiming and charging up powerful throw attacks does restrict you from other actions or assessing threats. It's typically smarter to throw the axe to freeze enemies and follow it up with a hefty kick to the face for massive damage. Enemies tend to be rather spongy in this title, which is definitely something universally criticized in its own right, so it's useful to utilize this tactic. Walls, drop zones, and environmental hazards can be used also in tandem with this kick as finishers, but the geometry is hardly consistent. God of War's combat environments look gorgeous, but they often don't register appropriately unless Kratos is facing the exact correct angle. Still, it's damn intense and there are plenty of options. Bare hand combos, blocks, parries, delay attacks, cancels, runic attacks, combos, and times that by 2 when you get the Blades of Chaos. Between all the various upgradable systems and abilities, combat is deeper than it first appears. The constant juggling of your tools and attacks while rolling, dodging, and comboing and reading the enemy landscape in front of you with your cooldown meters is where God of War is actually at its best. When you can see everything that's going on and have space to move around and react, God of War's combat is pretty damn satisfying. Atreus also plays a pretty big role, much more than players would likely expect, showering the screen in arrows, status effects, and crowd control that Kratos needs to stay safe. In fact, if upgraded first, he nearly doubles your damage output. He could even spawn pets and health potions on cooldown as well. It was likely a decision to give Atreus a large role in combat to reinforce the story's strong father-son dynamic, by turning him into a player-controlled threat rather than a computer-controlled traveling companion such as Elizabeth from Bioshock Infinite. It's also a priority to credit God of War with having phenomenal boss fights, specifically the Valkyrie throwdowns, which showcase some really fun gameplay mechanics and outstanding music. The reason these fights stick out is that the movesets the Valkyries use are just downright fun to duel against, and the mechanics are what makes fights enjoyable in games. Many games should learn from the design of the Valkyrie fights in God of War. They also support the game's story pretty nicely, as Kratos and Atreus are not hunting down these Valkyries out of bloodlust, they're trying to free them. This synergizes really well with Kratos' newfound parental/protector role, which strengthens the character transformation he experiences in this game. I wish, however, the game focused more on its bosses because there aren't that many, as much of the time is dedicated rather to exploration. Outside of combat, God of War provides a much different flow to its game, prioritizing story exposition, puzzles, and loads of climbing, downtime, and setup. Akin more to Nathan Drake's Adventures or Tomb Raider more than anything else, it's Sony's new third-person narrative action game, and it comes with the same upsides and downsides as any other. For one, puzzles in God of War seem mostly here to break up the flow of the rest of the game, which is more or less combat, boat riding, and cutscenes. Unfortunately, they aren't very exciting and they're very laborious. There are generally two types of puzzles in games. Puzzles where you have to figure out how the puzzle is solved, which can take a few minutes, but once you do, you execute the solution immediately, which is critical thinking, and puzzles where you immediately understand how the puzzle is solved and have to spend those minutes executing the solution, which is linear thinking. God of War almost always falls into the second camp. For example, destroying bells to unlock chests. In these scenarios, you approach the puzzle area and immediately understand what needs to be done. There's no thought processing or puzzle solving. The only thing you can do is stop and scan the entire area looking for the faint outline of these bells. It's a mindless game of lean forward and gaze into every nook and cranny the game has, up, down, left and right, side to side, until you spot the thing the puzzle wants you to spot. So you either spend 3 minutes playing Where's Waldo, or you ignore it. Not only does this result in zero player mental stimulation or critical thinking, which is the point of puzzles, but it shatters the momentum of the game. Here's another example. Upon entering this area, it's easy to understand that Kratos and Atreus need this claw to latch onto a big box so it can pull them up through the mineshaft. It takes about 10 seconds to see this. So it's a puzzle that isn't really a puzzle. It's basically an exercise in moving things around for 5 minutes until you can actually get the thing done. Again, it's not a puzzle you need to think critically about. You spend all of the time on the steps to finish the puzzle, which are all rather mundane, rather than spending the time finding a solution to the problem, which is always more intrinsically satisfying as it provides that aha moment. It begs the question if these types of puzzles were worth it, or if the game would have been better suited focusing more on combat and bosses. On one hand, too much of anything can be bad. The first bite of a cheeseburger is god tier. The last bite, once you're damn near full, isn't nearly as satisfying. You can't have all combat, the player would grow tired. This is why platformers mix it up each level, or why Street Fighter 2 has you smash cars or barrels as you progress through the story mode. Substitution is essential in games to avoid the distaste that can come from repetition, especially if the thing we're trying to preserve is the core game mechanic. Personally, I wouldn't mind the puzzles so much in God of War if the other main component that helps the puzzles do this was better than it is. Climbing and exploration is what I'm referring to, and I'd like to take a moment first to appreciate which of those elements is utilized far better. God of War's boat system is not only a relaxing break from combat and for the most part mechanically enjoyable, but it's also used to shepherd humor, information, plot, and backstory to the player. Often this stuff requires dedicated screen time, such as a cutscene, which takes control away from the player, so this is a big bonus. Kratos' head and boy banter back and forth with row and tow, tales of the past, stupid jokes, and personal chit-chat. Not only does it flesh out their characters, but it's often used to bring the player up to speed on current and past events. Head recounts stories, boy questions head, and more is revealed. Over the course of the game, Kratos begins to chime in more as their bonds grow, even telling jokes himself. It's the modern-day car ride that you see in so many other games, and its function as a game system and as a tool for exploring the island is as good as you can hope for. Exploration on foot, however, is often monopolized by climbing, opening doors, and automated content, as well as restrictive control sections that eat up a huge piece of the game. All very slow content that again doesn't provide much in the way of player input outside of backtracking. To be honest, climbing is boring and doesn't have any interesting mechanics behind it. You want it to be like Uncharted 4's best moments with a rope swing, but it's like Uncharted 2. Why it takes a god of this power almost 4 seconds to open up a door is beyond me. Fine for the first door, but it's pretty unnecessary for the next 50. Why you have to walk with this pig in your hands for 2 minutes and 35 seconds even though it's about to die at any second is anyone's guess. I'm pretty sure Kratos could make the run to Freya's house and guarantee the pig didn't die, but I guess the game makes you walk so you can watch the turtle house pop up. I mean, it's pretty cool, it's beautiful, very beautiful, but there's not much gameplay here. These moments give weight to the game, but they often require patience in a series that was otherwise known previously for ripping people's heads off. This God of War game is pretty slow and it's different. It's not so bad the first time you play the game, as the scenery and presentation can leave you dumbfounded and oblivious to what you give up in return. Good lord does it look good, but a second playthrough opens up one of the title's more pressing concerns, and that is pacing. Pacing comes in the form of two: micro-pacing, which are the things players do minute to minute and back to back, and macro-pacing, which is looking at all the activities of the game and seeing how they stacked up to each other to form a whole. On a macro level, God of War seems to be just fine on paper. Introduction and unexpected villain, minor resolution and a clear goal, a heavy dose of combat, followed by some exploration, a puzzle, a sprinkling of loot, a boss fight, a cutscene, a boat ride, more combat, a quest, another boat ride, a boss, etc. Repeat this bucket of activities several times, throw in a plot twist, a sudden catastrophe, re-anchor the relationship of Kratos and Boy, change the narrative angle before the finale, get ready for a surprise, and there you go. It's all fine and dandy. However, when analyzing the micro-pacing, most of the good in these elements have a coinciding side effect, and that is not so fine and dandy. Exploration is fun, but climbing is laborious and very uninteractive. World building is superb, but often interrupted by forced walking sections and automation even when time is of the essence. Fast travel is well done, except the part where you have to walk through this level while the game loads in the background. Gameplay is great, but some of the boss fights, including the dragon boss and the finale, are not all that interesting and pander too much to in-your-face popcorn cinema. Enemies are for the most part good, but can be extremely spongy. World design is brilliant, but scaling difficulty and loot makes going back to quests you've pushed aside sometimes pointless. Finding loot is fun, but pick-up text boxes get annoying fast, and the UI is time-consuming. And the overabundance of silver makes skill tree and crafting decisions pretty much a non-factor. The overarching story of Kratos and Atreus is compelling to the end though, especially seeing Kratos take off his chains during the finale in Jotunheim. He does come full circle in this game, from muffled, harsh tutor, never showing his true past, to compassionate, godlike father, and the game does a great job visually showcasing it. The two physically start off distanced, literally. They never touch. Kratos is the tough guy teacher and Atreus obeys him like a reluctant student. Atreus reacts by closing himself off, sometimes talking under his breath, and it pisses Kratos off. Eventually, Kratos opens up as more is revealed. The boy proves himself in combat, and Kratos praises him. His confidence grows, and Kratos sees it. By the end, Kratos wraps his hand around his shoulder and draws him in. Understandably, immediately transforming Kratos into a caring, sensitive father would pretty much have destroyed his established character, not to mention be a giant slap in the face to longtime fans. So the fact that the entire game is his character arc makes the payoff much more natural and believable. If it weren't for the abrupt moment in the middle of the story where Atreus starts acting like a complete dick for reasons, I think he'd be the perfect companion for Kratos in this title. Many games do the parental relationship: father-son, father-daughter, brother-sister. God of War sells itself as a violent father's redemption story, but the nuance at which it tells the story is pretty damn impressive. It's tough to make it work because you deal with such extremes. So for such a short game to bring these two characters together, while giving plenty of screen time to Head, and dancing a tightrope with Kratos and his history, and providing a satisfying ending that still leaves plenty of questions lingering in the air, I think they did a pretty damn good job here. Freya and Baldur fare pretty well too, despite the fact that these two fights with Baldur are pretty underwhelming, more spectacle and dazzle than actual boss battles. While it's odd at first to see Freya so willingly help our companions, her numerous plot twists and character arcs, mother to Baldur, goddess, ex-wife of Odin, champion of the Valkyries, and plenty more, flesh her out as one of the more primary characters of the game and an absolute necessity story-wise. In fact, she's really the only other character in the game besides the two dwarfs who act as some sort of comedic relief in this otherwise very slow, serious, somber tale. Freya's contribution to the final Baldur fight was in fact one of the best parts of that fight. She tries to save him, begging for mercy as Kratos grabs him like a little clown boy and snaps the last breath out of him like the crack of a roaring thunderstrike. She's clearly going to be in the next game, friend turned foe, leaving the game on the promise that she'll hunt him down and seek vengeance for killing her son. The perfect motivation for a sequel and a future villain, yet doesn't approach it with a hollow cliffhanger. It's good stuff. God of War sells itself as a violent father's redemption story, and it does make good on that promise. Initially, when it was released, it was a pretty mesmerizing game to look at and play. The more time I spend with it though, the more I see its flaws. Taking the plunge into unexpected waters with this new concept was a gigantic risk that deserves kudos by itself. God of War is certainly a great video game and is quite enjoyable, but that's not to say it can't be improved or critiqued. And if I was a hardcore Legacy fan, I definitely wouldn't like the idea of replacing my endless combo carnage with precision circle strafing, because it's a modernized version of something we've already played 10 times before. But it's still a solid game, and here's hoping for an even better sequel.
I carried him home on his shield and buried him with all the honors of Spartan custom. His memory was a comfort in dark times.
Wow, you actually told a good story. But we missed it.